For centuries, philosophers have been chasing this holy grail, a proof for God's existence that doesn't rely on science or faith, but on pure, cold logic alone. And in the 20th century, a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga came along and said he'd finally done it, with a new version he called victorious.
And that really is the big question we're tackling today, isn't it? Can you really start with just an idea, the idea of a perfect being, and just by following a few logical steps, prove that it has to exist in the real world? Plantinga's argument says you can. So let's dive in and see how it works, and maybe more importantly, why it's still so fiercely debated.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. First, we're going to build Plantinga's victorious argument from the ground up. Then we'll look under the hood at the powerful logic engine that makes it run. After that, we'll really put it to the test, looking at its biggest weakness, some hilarious parody attacks, and a truly mind-bending counterargument. And finally, we'll step back and ask a bigger question. What does it even mean for a proof like this to succeed? All right, let's get right into the argument itself. What made Plantinga's version so brilliant was how it managed to dodge all the classic objections that had tripped up philosophers for hundreds of years. He did this by changing the conversation. Not just about existence, but about necessary existence. And he built the whole thing around one absolutely critical concept. And that concept is maximal greatness. Now, listen closely, because this is key. This isn't just about a being who's all-powerful and all-knowing in our world. Nope, a being with maximal greatness has those perfect qualities, what he calls maximal excellence, in every single possible world you could ever imagine. It's a kind of universal ironclad perfection. And this difference is everything. See, maximal excellence is world-specific. A being could be perfect here, but maybe flawed in some other alternate reality. But maximal greatness, that's universal. It's an all-or-nothing deal. If a being has it, it has to be perfect everywhere, which means it has to exist everywhere. It can't just pop up in one reality and not another. So here's how the argument unfolds, step by step. It starts with a really small, almost harmless-looking premise. Just admit that it's possible for a maximally great being to exist. That's it. From there, logic just takes over. If it's possible, then it must exist in at least one possible world. But remember the definition? If it exists in one world, its maximal greatness means it has to exist in all of them. And that includes our world, the actual world. So therefore, it exists. I know, that leap from possible to actual feels like a magic trick. But it's not magic, it's a specific and pretty powerful system of logic. It's called S5 modal logic, and it's the engine that makes this entire argument go. And this is the absolute core of it, the rule that makes it all work. In the world of S5, if something could be a necessary truth, then it just is a necessary truth, period. So because a maximally great being is defined as existing necessarily, if you grant it's even possible, S5 logic says it must be actual. So how does S5 do this? It's built on 3 rules about how all these possible worlds are connected. Reflexivity is just the basic starting point. But symmetry is the real game changer here. It means the connection is a two-way street. If our world can see a possible world where God's existence is a necessary fact, then that world can see ours, which means that necessity radiates right back and applies to us too. Transitivity just makes sure there are no escape routes. Okay, so if the logic is so tight, where's the catch? Well, it all circles back to that very first step. The entire weight of this huge conclusion rests on that one tiny little word, possible. And what we actually mean by possible turns out to be the argument's greatest weakness. You see, it turns out there are 2 very different ways we use that word. There's epistemic possibility, which is just about what we know, or more accurately, what we don't know. It's saying, hey, for all I know, this could be true. But then there's metaphysical possibility. This is the heavy-duty stuff. It's about what is actually possible in the fabric of reality itself, completely independent of us. Plantinga's argument needs this second, much stronger kind. The classic analogy here, and it's a great one, is water. A few hundred years ago, it was totally possible epistemically to imagine that water was something other than H2O. We just didn't know any better. But was it ever metaphysically possible? No way. Water's very identity is H2O. And that's the big worry for Plantinga's argument, right? Is our gut feeling that God is possible just us being ignorant of some deeper contradiction? And this all leads to the biggest critique, that the argument is begging the question. Because of how S5 logic works, Saying it's metaphysically possible that a necessary being exists is basically the same thing as just saying a necessary being exists. It's not a small, innocent starting point for a skeptic. It's the whole ballgame, just phrased a little differently. Enter one of the argument's most famous modern critics, the philosopher Graham Oppy. And his strategy for taking this thing down is just brilliant. He doesn't try to find a flaw in the logic itself. Instead, he uses the logic to try and prove all sorts of ridiculous things to show that the system itself might be broken. So, the classic parity argument is for a perfect island. If the logic works for God, why not a necessarily existing perfect island? Now, Plantinga had a really clever comeback for this. He said that properties like knowledge or goodness have a built-in ceiling, an intrinsic maximum. But you can always make an island greater by adding one more palm tree or a prettier beach. There's no upper limit. But Oppy was just getting started. He came back with even smarter parodies that Plantinga's defense couldn't handle so easily. What if you just define an island as having necessary perfection? Or even worse, what if you use the exact same logic to prove the existence of a maximally evil being? If the logic works for both, you've got a serious problem. It seems to be proving way too much. And that leads us to what many philosophers think is the knockout blow. It's not a silly parody. It's a perfect mirror image of Plantinga's own argument, designed to prove the exact opposite. Just look at this. It's perfectly symmetrical. Plantinga starts on the left with a premise that seems reasonable to a believer. It's possible a maximally great being exists. But an atheist can start on the right with a premise that seems just as reasonable to them. It's possible a maximally great being does not exist. The exact same S5 logical engine takes that premise and spits out the exact opposite conclusion. A maximally great being is impossible. And what you end up with is a perfect stalemate, a standoff. The S5 logic is totally neutral. It's like a computer program that will give you whatever answer you want, depending on the data you feed it. The argument itself gives you no reason to pick one starting point over the other. It all comes down to your gut intuition before you even start doing the logic. So, if it all ends in a tie, is the whole thing a failure? Well, this is where the debate gets really interesting. Because what if we've been thinking about the goal of the argument all wrong? What if it was never meant to convert a skeptic in the first place? You've got two totally different ways of measuring success here. On one hand, you have Oppy's standard. A compelling proof has to be strong enough to persuade any rational person, even your opponent. But on the other hand, Plantinga's goal might be totally different, just to show that believing is rationally permissible. In other words, to show that it's not illogical or stupid. And Plantinga basically admits this. He says, look, this argument is never going to convince a committed atheist, because they'll never accept that first premise. Instead, he sees its value for the believer, the person who already thinks it's possible a perfect being exists. For them, the argument is a way of showing that their belief isn't just a blind leap of faith, it has a solid logical structure behind it. So where does that leave us? Plantinga's argument is this beautiful, fascinating piece of logical machinery. But it's not a silver bullet. It can't force a skeptic to believe. Its real value, its true power, might not be in what it proves about God, but in what it reveals about us. How it acts like a mirror, forcing us to confront our deepest, most fundamental assumptions about what is even possible. And that's the thought I really want to leave you with. After all these logical twists and turns, are we looking at a proof of God, or are we really just looking at a profound, powerful demonstration of the absolute limits of what human reason can do when it comes face to face with the biggest questions there are?